Welcome everybody to our latest tempo meeting, our latest tempo workshop. Today we have with us the illustrious Neil Alexander, and he's going to be talking to us a little bit about harmony. So before we start, make sure to mute yourself so you don't interrupt Neil.
Not you, Floyd.
I muted myself. You're right.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yes. So for your best view, you want to put it on speaker view, which is in the upper right-hand corner. Click on speaker view so you're seeing Neil do his thing.
You don't really want to. Well, I don't know why you would do that to yourselves, but that's okay. Do whatever you like.
All right. So without further ado, take it away, Neil.
Right on. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. Yeah. So Enrico reached out to me and asked me if I would teach this. And I'm happy to share what I know and what I've learned being in music for 40 years. I want to preface just by saying that I didn't go to college, barely finished high school. I was mostly self-taught. I studied with a jazz pianist from age 9 to age 13, who taught me the basics of navigating through changes and things like that. And then I got a synthesizer when I was 18 and just started playing around with oscillators and intervals. And of course, gigging constantly and checking out different sounds. And I began to develop my own theory about how different intervals have different emotional resonances. So if you were, and they can be combined in different ways. And using harmony while playing jazz or classical is quite different than there's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences in using harmony when doing electronic music. And then I started, in the last 10 years or so, I started meeting people who were doing electronic music, but didn't know the first thing about harmony. Like they had keyboard-based instruments, but they couldn't tell you a major chord from a minor chord. And I was like, how do you get there from here? But so in order to sort of address some of those, and they were still making great music. It had nothing to do with it. But for those interested in filling in some of the gaps, I'm happy to provide some of this information as I've grown to understand it. If I tried to show this course to any of my jazz musician friends, they'd laugh at me because it's so utterly basic. And there's so many, you can take this subject of harmony as far as you want. But what we're going to talk about today is really the nuts and bolts of why things sound the way they do and what kinds of things you can do within that context. So, we have to start with where we are, which is we have something called the tempered scale. Now, the tempered scale was developed. Oh, my phone's ringing. Hold on. Oh, my goodness.
Go ahead and answer it if you have to.
No, I'm not answering it. Hell with that. In fact, let me turn on Do Not Disturb on my devices here, because I don't want to be disturbed. Anyway, so mid-1700s, early 1700s, Johann Sebastian Bach and others were searching for a way to resolve the issues caused by intervals, people trying to tune their instruments to perfect intervals. Anybody that knows the history of harmony, Andrew, I suspect, as most of you probably do, perfect intervals sound great in the key of C, but as you then move away from the key of C into adjacent keys, they begin to get very discordant until finally they become dreadfully out of tune and unplayable. Now, this is because whatever you're tuning your instrument to, let's say you're tuning it to C, or in most cases A, the ratio, you're basing your intervals on the harmonic series. The harmonic series is and so on and so forth. And the relationships, all of those notes appear in the overtones of your fundamental. Now, so you're tuning your instrument to reflect those relationships, but they only work in the one key. They only actually work in the one key that you're using it. So, there's been many books written about this, and there's a lot of information. But eventually, a system was worked out where an instrument can be out of tune by a very precise amount. Like it actually has to be out of tune. Each interval has to be out of tune by a precise amount. And then the same intervallic relationships can be brought into every key. So you can go. And it maintains its integrity of being in tune with itself for each key. And that became the de facto standard for most of European classical music going forward from Bach's time up to the present day. And of course, you always have those people doing traditional music who go back and use just intonation or mean tone tuning or a handful of other things. And then there's microtones. We'll get to that later. But so where we are now is we have this tempered scale. And it stays the same. In any key, it's going to remain in tune with itself, which is extraordinarily useful for doing all kinds of music. Of course, electronic music wouldn't come along for another 300 years or so. But there's a fun story that I like. You guys know who Herb Deutsch is. Herb is a friend of mine, and you probably know this story. And he was working with Bob Moog in the 1967 or something like that, and they were using a doorbell to trigger this new invention called an envelope generator, and making interesting sounds with oscillators and filters and things, and they needed a way to move the pitch of the oscillators around reliably. And Herb, who was a contemporary classical composer, said to Bob, "Hey, I gotta tell you, if you put like a keyboard on this thing, you'll probably sell more of them." And that is where we have the delineation between the East Coast and the West Coast schools, because I think Don Buchla still doesn't have equal tempered control surfaces on his instruments or on them. I played around with a couple of Buchlas. I love our friend from Reading Rainbow who did his workshop. That was terrific. I love the Buchla. I love the aesthetic. I love what's possible with it, but they're not designed to play in tune in that sense that us non-electronic Western musicians are kind of have come to expect. I have a lot of keyboard instruments behind me, as you can see. I made a choice at one point to move away from modular synthesis, which I very much enjoy, but it's not practical for what I do, and go to synthesis controlled by keyboard interfaces. And I find I can get a lot more accomplished, even without the modular accessibility. Plus, more and more instruments have internal modulation routings that function almost as comprehensively as a modular synth. My Prophet 12, for example, has, I don't know, 100 modulation routings, and you can route any parameter to any parameter. And for all intents and purposes, that's your modular synth. And then you can introduce things like randomness into pitch, and there's a lot of other things that you can do. But I'm starting to drift off the topic here. Okay, so let's see. So I told you the Herb Deutsch Bob Moog story, and now to get into the basics of it, we're going to explore the sounds of different intervals. An interval is the distance between two notes, and it can be any two notes. Let's see. I am going to share a screen here, if you're cool with that. At C and moving up in pitch, we have the half steps. Stop me if you've heard this one before. And we're going to stop there. Now, each one of these intervals has its own sound and its own quality. Some of them are harsh. Some of them are neutral. Some of them are. Some of them have kind of like a lightness. Some of them have a darkness. So all of those different qualities, I have found it very helpful over the years to familiarize myself as an improviser with all those different qualities. And then you can start to mix and match them. Now, I do an ear training trick, and I highly recommend that if you want to learn intervals, you try this. You pick an interval and you try to identify it by sound. So let's go through the names of them again. Actually, I can't say again because we haven't done it yet. So that's a minor second or a half step. That's a major second. That's a minor third. That's a major third. That's a perfect fourth. That's an augmented fourth or a flat fifth, depending on who you ask and what day of the week it is. That's a perfect fifth. That's a minor sixth. That's a major sixth. That's a minor, or also known as a dominant, 7. And that's a major 7. Now, the reason we stop there is because once you get there, then you're repeating the same intervals. But what I was going to say earlier about something to work on is being able to identify the sound of intervals, even if they're far apart on the keyboard. So, example, that's a dominant 7. You reduce like you're reducing in fractions, bring the notes close together, and you get the actual interval. This is something that I give to all my piano students. And I say, close your eyes. What's this interval? What's this interval? What's this interval? So basically you can train yourself to recognize those sounds. And that's key to being able to use the sounds and the feelings that they emote effectively. Okay, any questions so far?
I have a question about the names of the intervals. Why are they so different? Like one's like major, one's perfect, one's something. Why were they named so differently?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. It's from a very long time ago. It probably has to do with the overtone series and how far out of tune something has to be to keep an instrument in temperament. as it's called.
Okay.
I don't know. I've never looked into that.
That does make sense though. I've always wondered that why they were why the names so like differently.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, basically you have major and minor, and then you have perfect and augmented. Yeah, 2-to-1 perfect octave. Whoever posted that, that is correct. Perfect due to the original ratios. Yeah, that's what I suspected. All right. So let's see. Where are we? We're not there. Stop it. I'm yelling at Zoom. Okay. Um. All right. So now you're going to create music using a keyboard. Sometimes it's helpful to define a key center or a tonal center that you're going to work around. So that could be any note that you choose. And let's say we choose a E. Right. Oh, I see. I know why that did that. Okay. It's actually still working. See? I want to get a timbre that doesn't fade. Okay. So, um, so once you've defined a tonal center, you can base your intervals around that sound. And then you can then, once you've established a kind of a vibe or a feeling based on your choice of intervals, then you can change the tonal center and you can modulate to a different key. So let's say we do something relatively simple like a 1, 5, 7, dominant 7 in this case. So we have this sound. Maybe we're juicing it with a little delay or something. Now we shift the whole thing. Now, it affects what sounds like a big change, but I've only changed the tonal center. I haven't changed any of the intervallic relationships in the makeshift sequence. So, and that's the very, very basic idea behind modulating. Now, of course, you can also modulate and then change those intervallic relationships also, and so you can create these like harmonic landscapes, and each one based on a different tonal center, and then mix them and match them. I was listening to some Klaus Schultz today, and he was doing this thing where it was I forget what piece it was, but it had like a minor, and I went to a different minor, and it modulated very slowly over time. So it was kind of like. So he was changing the intervals one at a time very gradually, and I found that to be very interesting. That's something that you find in a lot of minimal music too. People like our friends Steve Reich and Philip Glass, who are really into this idea of very slow changes over time, which is something very much a part of ambient music. Okay, so getting back to a single tonal center, I'm going to change to C this time. Now, you have different scales that you can build, different collections of notes. A scale is just a bunch of notes in a row defined by the key signature that you're in. With 12 notes on the keyboard, 1, 2, 3, 4. And with equal temperament, you have effectively 12 different keys that you can play in. Now, the keyboard is divided up into white and black notes, as we know. And so to get the scale to sound the same, starting in different places, you add different amounts of flats and sharps, depending. So in the key of C, there are no flats and sharps. It's natural. And we're talking about C major here. We're going to talk about minor and alternate modes in a few minutes. But then if you're going to start in the key of, say, E flat, and you want the same sound, the E flat has 3 flats in it. Now, why it has 3 flats and not some other arbitrary number has to do with these things called the cycle of fourths and fifths. But now we're getting ahead of ourselves. So going back to E flat. So the sound is the same, but it has 3 flats in it. So each key is going to have a different collection of sharps and flats. Key of A, for example, has 3 sharps. In case anyone is unclear about this, a sharp is when you go up a half step, and a flat is when you go down a half step. And it's all based on the working off the white keys. So for example, key of F has 1 flat. So if I'm playing in C with no sharps or flats, and then I want to play in the key of F, and I want the same sound, I don't get the same sound because that interval doesn't exist in the key of C. To get it to match, you have to flat this note. So you're using the flats and sharps to bring all the other keys into the same sound as the key of C. And like I said, we're just working in major chords right now. The next thing I want to discuss is something called scale tone harmony. So now we've looked at the scale. We see that there's different sharps and flats that make each scale sound like it's supposed to sound in the key, whatever key that you're in. Quickly, I'll mention this idea of the relative minor. So in C, the relative minor is always going to be a minor third below the tonic of the major key. So in this case, and the relative minor is A minor. And the reason that works out that way is because that's the key where you get what's called a natural minor scale without changing any sharps or flats. So each major key, say A, has a relative minor. that's just an important little side note of information that is helpful to have filed away somewhere. It will become useful at some point. Okay, so now if you take a chord, and now what we're going to do is we're talking about scale, tone, harmony. So we're going to take each note of the chord and move it through the scale. And you'll hear the chord quality changes. So we have major chord, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, and major again. Is anyone here not clear on the concept of major and minor chords?
I am clear.
Yeah, I had a feeling. This is pretty basic stuff. So, scale tone chords, we're moving through, we're moving multiple voices through a single key. And you can do a lot with that. I have songs that are now that's all done in the key of C using scale tone chords. So there's no sharps or flats, and as you can hear that you can get a lot of harmonic motion out of that, a lot of emotion and a lot of harmonic motion. And that's an easy way to work with intervals and harmony without having to get too complicated. Now modes, on the other hand, are a function of scale tone harmony. So in the key of, we can stick in the key of C for now. That's the names come from church modes in the 1600s, and the names are Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. And I don't know what those words mean. I suspect they're Latin in origin, but each one has its own sound. And you get to them by starting on a different you know, my brain is, I can't remember words anymore. It's a different step of the scale, but step is not the word that I'm, anyway. So, in the key of C, that's your Ionian mode. That's your basic major mode. If you shift, that's called a Dorian mode. That is where you find a lot of rock and roll. That's all Dorian. And that's different than the natural minor. The natural minor being the relative minor. So that's the Dorian mode, and it's kind of like the rock and roll mode. A lot of people use that for those kinds of sounds. Moving on, the next one we get is Phrygian, and this is where it starts to get interesting. really specific sound. It's very identifiable. A little bit on the exotic side. Moving on, the next one is the Lydian mode, which is similar to major, except it has an augmented fourth. So instead of having the perfect fourth, we talked about that one flat in the key of F, because modes are based on scale tone motion, and we're in the key of C, all the notes have to remain natural. So we have this kind of a yearning sound. And that's a Lydian mode. I'm sure you'll hear that in lots and lots of music. There's a famous David Gilmour song called Mihalis from his first solo record that sounds like this. And it's all based on that mode. The whole song is based on that feeling, that vibe. Okay, so that's Lydian. Next one is the Mixolydian, which is also considered the dominant chord. The 5 chord, we're going to add numbers to all the notes. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And these are Roman numerals. The 5 is considered the dominant chord because it naturally has a flat 7 in it. And it dominates the feeling, and it wants to go to the tonic. It wants to resolve. That's the...
Hey, Neil.
Which part of Terrapin Station are you thinking? Because it goes through a lot
The
of...
entire first section, Lady with a Fan.
That section?
Yes.
That's Lydian, not Mixolydian.
No, it isn't. No, start that on F. And that's the lead in, and then it goes into Mixolydian when the chords start.
But it settles. That's a perfect example of a piece that moves around a lot within scale tone chords. So the whole chord progression, it doesn't modulate. There's a lot of chords, there's a lot of motion, but it's all staying basically in the key of C, or in the same same key.
It gets an awful lot of richness out of never touching the black keys.
Exactly. Yeah. It's because they really understood intervallic relationships and the different feelings that come from different kinds of chords. You find this stuff in all great songwriting. Anyway, I haven't thought about Terrapin Station in a long time. That's funny. Okay. So the Mixolydian mode, like I said, has the dominant 7 in it. And it's good. It has that kind of like, it wants to go somewhere. Still has that major third, so it has a fundamentally brighter sound, fundamentally more uplifting kind of sound than it would if it was like say in a Dorian mode. So that major to minor third change can be is very powerful. It does a lot of, you're gonna get a lot of stuff out of those two collections of intervals. Moving on, the next one is let's see, Aeolian? No, yes, yeah, and that's the natural minor. It just happens to line up with it. Now the Locrian, which is the last one in the first set of 8 major modes, is very similar to the Phrygian, but even more dissonant. It's also it's the opposite of the Lydian. The Lydian and the Locrian are the only ones where you find a augmented fourth or flat 5, which is the same note. So the Lydian and in the Dorian, in the Locrian, you get that same grungy interval. But the Lydian has that major third, where the Locrian has a minor third. So the reason I'm going through these is because I encourage you all to familiarize yourselves with these sounds just by playing around on a keyboard, even with a piano sound, or any kind of sound, just to familiarize yourself with I'm going to switch to a piano here actually, since I have one loaded up and it seems to be working.
Sounds great.
Thank you. So let's see, where am I? Yeah, there's other collections of intervals. Scale is a collection of intervals, right? And there's a formula for that. The major scale has a relatively simpler formula, which is whole tone, half tone, whole tone, half tone. So it's whole, half, whole, half. That's what they call the formula for a major scale. Now you can screw around with that formula and start to come up with all kinds of interesting things. For example, a whole tone scale is all whole steps. There's no half steps. Where a chromatic scale is all half steps. Or strange combinations, like say whole step, half. There's something called a diminished scale, which alternates whole steps and half steps. So it's whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. And that has a really specific sound. I happen to find that to be very interesting. And the one I first did was starting on a whole step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. There's also the reverse of that. Half step, whole step, half step, whole step. And now these are the kind of scales that started being used in more contemporary classical music around the turn of the century, when people like Rimsky-Korsakov and Ravel and Stravinsky were starting to stretch the boundaries of harmony. They started finding and using these other scales, these non-natural scales. So there's a lot of fun to be had there. There's a great book by Nicholas Slominski called The Thesaurus of Scales and Melodic Patterns. I was looking for it earlier. I have it in the house somewhere, but so I could show it to you, but I highly recommend that you check it out. I'm going to put it in the chat here. Nicholas Slominski. Thesaurus of Scales and Melodic Patterns. A lot of really great jazz players I know practiced out of this book. They just go through, it's like 800 pages, and they're collections of intervals that go across multiple octaves. So for example, it could be major third, flat 5, major third, flat 5. So that would be. And so you're just stacking up these intervals and you get these much larger patterns that don't even fit, that won't fit into a single octave. And he does all kinds of things where he'll do it like the one I just did. Major third, flat 5, major third, flat 5, and then he'll flip that on its head. Flat 5, major third, flat 5, major third, flat 5, major third. And so he builds these constructs that get continuously more and more complex. And they can show you, it's a good way to see what's possible with intervals, because this, the sky's the limit. There's only 12 notes, but they can be combined in infinite ways. So check out that book if you can. It's really fascinating. Now, as composers and people doing composing music and doing electronic music, either from a compositional standpoint or an improvisational standpoint, I think it's key to find the emotional qualities of the harmonic movement that you're going for. You want something that's neutral sounding or sad or here, hang on, I'm gonna load up a analog synth and an arpeggiator. So that's a using only the interval of a perfect fifth and an octave. There's a very neutral sound, right? It's like, it's not, I mean, it has its own energy, but it's not giving you any emotional content. It's very kind of smooth. Now, what if we add an interval to that? Let's see. Let's add a flat minor second somewhere. So we can add that going out at the top of the scale or in the bottom of the scale or somewhere in there. We'll add a flat second. Let's add it at after the 5. So start here. Now I'm going to add the flat second. Now all of a sudden it has a radically different feeling to it. More of a kind of a darker thing. And now we can change that again and add and either move it to a different place or just change the interval altogether. So now I'm going to add a major second. Again, the feeling changes completely, right? You can hear it, you can feel it. Speed this, accelerate this a little bit here. So you can hear I'm just sort of randomly changing notes while the arpeggiator is running. And each collection of notes gives you a very different feeling. So as a composer, then you can write for collections of notes. Let's pick a couple of collections of notes. I'm going to increase the arpeggiator speed to twice as fast. So let's pick some notes. Let's say C, D, B flat, and D flat. C, D, B flat, and D flat. So that's I have the synth set to mono. I'm going to turn it back to poly in a minute. But all right, so let's see what that sounds like. That's a little bit dissonant. You may want to change one of those. Let's change the D flat to an F. So we're going to change it to that note. Now, I'm just purely talking about harmony and intervallic relationships. I'm not talking about what you can then do with the rhythm of a sequence where you can have notes repeat more than once, so you can emphasize certain aspects of the harmony that you're using, you know, like so that's displacing the harmony rhythmically, but we're not going to talk about that today. We're just talking about intervals. So we have one collection of intervals right now. We have a C, a D, B flat, and an F. Now let's pick a different set of intervals. These particular notes don't really make a classical chord, like a major or a minor chord. They just are, it's kind of a neutral, amorphous kind of sound. So now let's make our next collection of intervals a really recognizable chord, like say a major or a minor chord. And we don't want to start from any of the notes we're using. So we want to go to a different, we want to pick a different tonal center and then build our minor chord, let's say minor chord, on that different tonal center. So one of the things we can do is we can look and see what scale these notes fall into. Now, if we do it in the key of C, we get. We don't have to use the key of C. We can pick an entirely different set of intervals that will contain these notes. But that's what we have right now. And now we're going to pick another something to complement this that's going to be totally outside of this group of intervals and this group of notes. So let's say we want to start on A flat. And we want to just make a minor chord. Change this. Okay, so now if we run the two chords and we alternate back and forth between them, now with just a few simple harmonic tools and just understanding sounds of the intervals and picking random sets of intervals and random tonal centers, we can create music that's actually can be kind of compelling. Okay, any questions at this juncture? No? Okay, cool. All right, so the other thing that we can do, and I wanted to talk about this, is how those kinds of intervals sound when they're played together using drones. Because drones make up a large part of electronic music and ambient music. I'll start with a simple, interesting sound. And then you can add intervals to that, and the resulting collection of notes will all have different kinds of sounds. So here's a tonic, and I'm going to add major second on top of that. I'm going to add a flat 5 on top of that major second. So from the tonic, it's going to be a flat 6, but for the new note, it's going to be a flat 5. Now let's add another note. Let's add a major 7th up from this new note, which is an A flat. So the major 7th up from an A flat is going to be a G natural. And then you can add a major 2nd below that. And a 4th above that. I wouldn't necessarily say that was the only sound, the only thing you should do, but it's an effective, you can create a harmonic bed where then you can have other moving voices and other things happening on top of it. And then you can also change the intervals of that chord. I'm really not even thinking about what notes. I'm just playing random collections of intervals. I'm using wider intervals so you don't get so much dissonance, but I'm not really thinking about, oh, what notes am I going to play? I'm just kind of like, let's put my hands here and here. And then what does that sound? How does that make me feel? Then I can look at the keyboard and analyze what I've done. And we see we have a major 6th, and then a flat 5 on top of that, and a perfect 5th on top of that. And there's no name for that. There's no like official designation. You could place it into a harmonic context in Western harmony or in jazz harmony if you wanted to, but there's no need to do that. One of the basic things about this concept and this approach and working this way is that if it sounds good, it is good. If you like it, it doesn't matter what it is. So another thing I like to work with is larger intervals, more open voicings. So that's only 4 notes, but they're really far apart and very different. So you get this wide, this broad, expansive sound. And so, I mean, how I've learned to do this has all been trial and error over, 40 plus years. Of like, wow, what do these notes sound like together? What does this sound like together? Why does this feel a certain way? What if I do this? What if I have a big chord like that and change one note? And then change another note. And then change another note. Another note. And so I'm not like looking for a particular harmonic direction or a resolution or any of the classical terms or concepts that we find in Western music or European classical music or jazz. I'm just really working with raw sounds and raw the energy of the intervals and their interaction. Anyway, and you can look at those. I read an interesting book about harmonic theory that called when you have a bunch of notes, and this was talking about classical music, contemporary dissonant classical music, that it looked as groups of notes as sets, like in a Venn diagram. right? So you can have, let's say, C and D are going to now be in all the sets that you're going to go forward. So the first set could be now we're going to change everything, but we're going to keep our two notes in the set. So I changed all the other notes, but I kept these two notes. And you can do things like that. You can pivot around tonal centers. You can work with clusters of notes. And there's all kinds of different ways. So my whole point of doing this is to encourage y'all to go out and find stuff and don't be intimidated by the keyboard. I know a lot of you are not intimidated by the keyboard, but nevertheless, that was my point in doing this class today. Then we can talk about microtones and other things. I'm not even sure how I get to that in in Ableton. I have to call up a synth and change the tuning structure. But the same thing applies, except now you're working with microtonal intervals instead of tempered intervals. But you can build the same kind. You can find those same kind of emotional responses, same kind of motion, same kind of all the concepts that we talked about still apply. They just will sound completely different. Okay, any other questions?
Now
Well,
you were
Go ahead.
go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I sort of have some meta questions.
Oh, you muted yourself. Nope.
For some
Ah,
reason,
there you go.
other things were popping up on my screen, and I had to get rid of them before I could talk to the Zoom window.
Okay.
So I've been listening to a fair amount of sort of commercial-ish electronica recently, and one of the things I've noticed is that there seems to be a tendency towards very richly textured percussion with what seem to me as harmonic structures that are so naive as to be almost banal. And I, you probably hear more of this stuff than I do. And the question that I had is sort of how much of a trend, how much of a thing is that? I saw a review recently of a piece called Avril 14.
Okay.
By Aphex Twin, which apparently has Aphex Twin. Okay,
right.
You see it in print. You don't know how people pronounce it. This particular piece is sort of for solo prepared piano. Let me see if I can actually cause some of it to appear in your audio feed, because I'm sure you'll recognize it immediately, but not necessarily by title.
And it's for prepared piano?
It's for prepared piano, and as far as I can tell, not anything else.
Huh.
Now let's see how I do this. So this is just piano, and it is harmonically, it seems to me, the harmonies make Satie sound complicated by comparison.
Can you all hear that? It's probably really low.
It's really low.
All right, hang on.
There you go.
Got it. Okay. First of all, it doesn't sound. It sounds like the only preparation is maybe something on the hammers,
Yeah, probably right. Probably right.
but it's
And
not.
there's nothing.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
nothing.
I was actually thinking of a different one, that a different piece that was much more prepared, and I conflated the two. But this one's a good example because harmonically, it is incredibly simple.
Right.
And it's been around for 20 years, and it took the world by storm.
Did it?
Yeah, I mean, if to the extent that the New York Times did an article about this piece.
Really?
Yeah.
In 2002 or something like.
Let me find it.
It's listed as being coming out in 2001.
New York Times did an article on it in April 15th, 2021. The
Really?
long tail of Aphex Twin's Avril 14th continues to inspire curiosity and covers by classical, experimental, and pop artists.
Wow.
And I mean, it's harmonically, it is so simple.
Yeah, it's got it's about. Well, here's the thing. It's kind of about the feeling of it, right? It's not
Yeah.
sort of about if it's complex or not, or if it accomplishes anything. It's just about the feeling of it, and the tempo is set in a very specific way. Very measured, precise tempo setting to evoke that feeling.
Or another example, same, also by Aphex Twin, the sort of hard to spell title of Vordhosbn, Vordhosbn.
And which record is this on?
I don't remember. It may be on the same one. Let me find it.
Vordhosbn. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, and you'll see that it's incredibly frenetic percussion with, again, very harmonically simple stuff behind it.
Well, this is the hallmark of a style, actually, a specific style called drum and bass, or trance, where you have a very static or very slowly evolving harmonic landscape, and a lot of frenetic percussion, up tempo.
And boy, is it frenetic!
Yeah, and it's
every beat is different.
There's an artist that I quite like called Square Pusher.
Okay.
And he does this extraordinary stuff that's like, it's even more intense than Aphex Twin, and it's like, some of it is very. Let me find a track here. Some of it is.
If you like Aphex Twin, Autechre are good too. There's
Autechre. Well,
yeah, that was.
They're on a whole nother level. Actually.
There was another one I was going to, an Autechre track called Gaz Quarter, which is another one that is, again, harmonically very simple. And at least the first part of it is almost static, although, there's continuous sort of minor variation inside the percussion stuff.
Like here, all right, here's a track by Square Pusher called Beep Street from a record called Hard Normal Daddy. And this is the track that, coming from my jazz and classical background and the harmonic background that I have, this track I fell in love with this, and then was my entry into this guy's work.
Okay.
The drums it's all done with editing, right? It sounds like it could be being played or maybe not. But check out when the bass comes in. Anyway, it goes on like that for quite a while. But you can hear that it's not really as simple as all that. There's a lot going on in there. The harmony gives you the feeling of this kind of like, it's got this longing. It's basically in a minor key. It's in that Dorian mode. It gives you that
And
feeling.
it sounds
of
like it's cycling through a small number of chords
right
over it with perhaps minor variations.
Right, exactly. So what you have is this bass line. It's a set bass line that runs, and then the chords are at, there's a series of chords that are perhaps at a different length. So you get this phasing between the bass line and the chord structure, and nothing is none of the harmony and the chords and the harmony and the bass never get too far away from each other. But there's enough variation to keep it interesting, at least relatively interesting. And with the drum editing, and the drum sounds, it's very propulsive, and I find it to be very compelling music. Because it's not just a static 2 or 3 note ostinato with the same
Right.
kind of percussion energy. It's got a little more going on. And he takes this concept in all kinds of different directions and all kind of variations. Like here's a piece called Chin Hippie. So and that goes on for quite a while, but there's no actual harmony. There's no discernible harmony in
Oh.
there. It's just collections of sounds. So this guy, Tom Jenkinson is his name, performing under the name Square Pusher. He goes back and forth from everything. There's another piece he has. He's a bass guitar player. So let's see if we can find this other piece. This is another piece of his that I quite like. It's called the Tomib Help Bus. And just a little repeated motif.
This music is not evenly tempered.
Well, actually, it is. No, you're right. It's not.
It's not equally tempered.
No, it's not. It's got some intervallic weirdness. It's also got delay, modulated delay.
Yeah, but I mean, listen to those thirds. They're narrowed from equal temperament.
That's
There's
correct.
some kind of nearly just intonation going on there.
So, my point being that the guy makes interesting music along the lines that we're talking about here, using collections of notes as opposed to classical harmony of any kind.
He's got some comments from Steve in chat.
Let's take a look here. Hello, Steve says about 15 to 18 years ago, I went to an art gallery that had an electronic music event where people did all kinds of things. I spoke with a few afterwards about what they were doing, such as one person having all sorts of polyrhythms playing against each other. Most of the artists had no idea what they were doing musically. They were just playing things that they thought sounded good together, and they did sound good together. Yes, that is precisely the point. in an undergrad class, one professor gave us the concept: if it moves, it's music. If it moves, interesting.
If it moves air.
Oh, if it moves
guess.
air.
No, I guess. I guess that's what that means. I don't know.
Well, music is generally defined as sound over time, right? Not necessarily in rhythm, but sound over time. That can be any kind of sound. It's like John Cage's organ piece. You all know about this piece that he wrote that's supposedly going to take 300 years to play. So it's running now. I think it's in like year 20 or something. And you know, there was
It's only on its like second note or something.
Yeah, and they're building additional organ pipes as they need them.
right. And it's going to be playing long after we're all gone. So it fulfills the description of sound over time, but it's on a different scale. And I find that stuff to be very fascinating. All right. You're welcome, Carl and Steve. If anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to discuss further, but I am at the end of my prepared material.
Well, thank you very much for coming, Neil. And it was great. I learned a lot tonight. I was scrambling to get my keyboard so I could follow along with you, but it was just no use. I got my studios in a total disarray right now because, you know, when Gianni called me like 5 minutes before this was going on and said, "Can you host tonight?" And I'm like, "Yeah, what's?" I didn't know what was going to happen, but you know, this was awesome, brother. Thank you very much. I'm glad we recorded it because I'm going to go back and follow along with what you were doing and everything on the keyboard.
All right. Excellent.
That was great, brother. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I hope this information is useful to anybody, anywhere.
Yes, it was great.
You know, like I said, I'm basically self-taught. I've figured a lot of this stuff out myself, and I keep working it. Luckily, I was taught to read and write music at a fairly early age, so I can read music and analyze it from this perspective as in addition to the traditional musical analysis perspectives. Yeah, and then you can make this as complicated as you want to. You listen to the pianist Bill Evans, and some of the things he does with harmony will, when you understand what he's doing, it makes your hair stand on it. It's so complicated. Anyway, all right. This is lovely. Wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much. And I'll see you all. I'll see you all at Neemfest, if not sooner. Those of you going to Mountain Skies, have a lovely time.
Thank you, Neil.
And we'll see you on the flip side.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
Have a good night.
Good night, y'all.